Hello, Robert Cherry. How are you?
Hi, glad for having me, Glenn.
Thank you. This is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and I'm Glenn Loury at Brown University. It's my pleasure to be speaking with Robert Cherry, who is a professor of economics at Brooklyn College and at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And Bob, you're stirring the pot yet again, and I wanted to get you on the Glenn Show to talk about these issues. You are a guy, if I may say so, and correct me if anything I say is wrong, who has been spending a lifetime as a scholar working on problems of inequality and race and labor, work, and so on. From a progressive point of view, you're an old lefty. You are an egalitarian. You're on the right side of history as far as progressive people might say. But you're also somebody who's very interested in the data. And your article, Race and Opportunity, which is forthcoming in the spring 2016 issue.
Winter issue.
I beg your pardon. Winter 2016 National Affairs Journal is very provocative and interesting. And so I asked you on the show to talk about the article and, kick around some of the ideas and implications. I'm very glad you agreed to come on. You want to start then by telling us a little bit about sort of what you're after in this article, Race and Opportunity. What do you think is the message there?
I think the message there is that there are very serious problems that the Black community faces. Much has been written about the mass unemployment of young Black men, and I've written about that before. In fact, in a spring issue of National Affairs, I had a long essay on the plight of these young Black men who face significant joblessness and what can be done about it. And I talk about that certainly in this new piece. But what is also at play in this new piece is a discussion of why the Black middle class has not simply been under pressure since the Great Recession, but has collapsed in many ways, and particularly for the children of this Black middle class. And so you don't have a hopefulness among a rising group, and it then plays out in a focus on the ills of capitalism, of white society, in ways that I don't think are very productive.
Well, okay, let me ask you two things. What are the broad facts about the collapse that you're calling attention to? And what is the inadequacy of the storyline that we know very well about white supremacy and white privilege, about structural racism, and the sense that the difficulties that you might call attention to are in some way or another due to a continuation of a regime that we knew too well from Jim Crow and so forth and so on. How is it that the Black middle class is troubled, and the social mobility for African Americans isn't matching up with what we see elsewhere in American society? And what's wrong with the sort of conventional reaction as reflected, for example, in the writings of Ta-Nehisi Coates at the Atlantic Monthly as giving an explanation for that?
Well, I think the collapse of the Black middle class has its roots in essentially the legacy of Jim Crow, that there were a number of progressive legislative acts, particularly the minimum wage, the GI Bill, that essentially excluded Black Americans. The minimum wage excluded agricultural workers and service workers.
Yeah.
So as I point out in the article, when President Roosevelt was wintering in Warm Springs, Georgia,
yeah,
the maid who served him dutifully was making less than 10 cents an hour, while the minimum wage was 25 cents an hour. So blacks were virtually excluded from the benefits of the minimum wage. And then when the GI Bill comes, they're excluded from the job training, the mortgages, because they were administered locally. And how they were administered in the Jim Crow South led to this massive exclusion of the benefits to black GIs. There was virtually no place they could get trained for a skill job in the South. And we're still in an era where 80% or more of black Americans lived in the Jim Crow South. So they don't have home ownership, they don't have skills. And so when finally, really their grandchildren are able to piece together a middle-class standard of living, it was often with two government non-professional jobs, a bus driver and a government clerk position. So they're already in a fragile position. They don't have, the social capital to pass on to their kids. They can't move into the better suburbs, so they can move into these inner suburbs where they are able to flee some of the chaos of the central city, but they don't have good schools. They just don't have what the white middle class have.
Sure.
And then when the recession hits,
yeah,
they're
more fragile.
They got these mortgages and fragile home ownership that gets collapsed. There's a cutback in government jobs, so either they're laid off or their kids can't get government jobs.
Well, let me just interrupt here for a minute. Excuse me. I got it so far. Fragile in part because of what Ira Katznelson called it when affirmative action was white, where he observes, as you did, that the New Deal, GI Bill, were so configured that even though they were not explicitly anti-black, they nevertheless had a differential and negative effect for blacks. And the fact that is casting a long shadow, that's very consistent with the argument that Ta-Nehisi Coates has made in The Atlantic for reparations, where he says, white people have been advantaged over history in ways that blacks have not. Blacks have been disadvantaged, and so there needs to be some compensation. Very consistent with what people like my colleague at Brown, Professor Tricia Rose, would call structural racism, where they would say that it doesn't require any longer explicit no black need apply sign, that there are indirect ways in which blacks are disadvantaged. So how is your observation about that at all inconsistent with the spirit of our times, which basically says it's white people's fault either today or yesterday, but in any case, it's white people's fault about what's going on?
Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, I think Coates' article on reparations was a pretty good article. And as I mentioned in the book, and we'll get to, I think his first book on Baltimore was a pretty good book. So my concern is with how this then plays out. First of all, this doesn't primarily play out with Black Lives Matter talking about how to re-energize a black middle class. What plays out is a discussion of what happens to the underclass. Those blacks who have limited education, are on the streets, don't have work, how they are victimized by the police. That's how it plays out. So I would have no qualms if this was a forerunner to a discussion where Jesse Jackson and others would talk about getting more jobs for black college graduates in the internet sector, in the entertainment industry, in managerial positions besides food and health. That's what this would be a link to, is that there are these continued barriers that exist. Now, part of it is the skills of the black kids, part of it is networking. So it's not some evil Google saying we don't want to hire blacks, or Spielberg saying we'll hire black cameramen. We want to hire blacks in the backdrop, in the writing, and so on. But that's what this collapse of the black middle class would lead to. and this structural racism that led to this weak position of the black middle class, that's what it would lead to. But that's not what Coates in his new book, that's not what Black Lives Matters discuss, is how to get corporate America to be much more sensitive to the kind of networking and skill requirements it uses, because they're excluding black professionals, black college graduates, from the better jobs that our new society is generating.
Okay, this is, I think, very stimulating. If I'm following you, you want to make a distinction between the social impediments that limit opportunities for the very, very poor amongst the African Americans, such as people in communities like what we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, or in Baltimore, Maryland, on the one hand, and a relatively more advantaged, but still, in comparison to whites, disadvantaged component of the African American community, what you're calling the black middle class. And you're stressing that the program of protest and organization and activism that we associate with Black Lives Matter, and that has spilled over onto the campuses in a number of places, is kind of driven by the latter, by the problems of the very poor urban African American lower class. But the area for fruitful intervention might well be vis-a-vis the former. There's the relatively better off African Americans, but who still are, for one reason or another, not being brought in as well as they might be to the opportunities that exist. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I mean, you can also correct.
Well, it'll be clarified in our discussion a little bit more.
Okay. So you say Coates' first book, and I think viewers may not know Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer at The Atlantic, whose book, Between the World and Me, won a National Book Award and has been a bestseller for ever since it was published, and is riding very high, is the author, that's a memoir, Between the World and Me, a letter to his son in the spirit of James Baldwin's letter to James Baldwin's nephew that was published in the early 1960s. Coates has another book, a prior memoir. I can't recall the title of it. You will.
The Beautiful Struggle.
A Beautiful Struggle, describing his life coming along in Baltimore. And you see that the second book really, as it were, doesn't take cognizance, again, correct me if I say this wrongly, of the insights that he rendered in the first book. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, that's what. So if you read the first book, The Beautiful Struggle, which details his growing up in Baltimore up to the time he goes, he's admitted to Howard University. He talks about the chaos in the 80s in Baltimore, where it's really a culture of poverty narrative. He talks about pregnancies, that you had nurseries in high schools, absent fathers, shootings that started over trivial matters on the street, the randomness of the violence, the sort of chaos that was all around him. But what distinguished him was he came from a stable two-parent family. And in the book, it's very clear that it was in particular because of his father's strong hand and intervention that he and his 5 siblings all went to college. And there are instances where particularly his older brother was going off track, was a little bit involved with low-level drug sales.
Yeah.
And but it was the family intact, the father's engagement that led all 6 of these siblings to go to college. And in fact, he's the only one of the 6 who didn't graduate college. And there's no police in the book. There's no racism in the school system. In fact, the violence that he experiences is because he was a nebbish, and he was in the special track of students, and he got picked on because he was in this. But there's nothing about racism of teachers, of police, of community. It's all what is motivated by black behavior.
Bob, just a side, nebbish, is that Yiddish for nerd or something?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
thanks. I interpolated. I don't know any Yiddish, but I just figured that out.
I'm reliving my childhood.
Anyway, go on. We were talking about the relationship between these books.
So here he has a certain narrative, and none of it shows up in his new book. In his new book, he's really more like Malcolm X. I don't see how he's James. I mean, the meter of his speech, the pattern of his writing, the broad attack on white society, where he even defends feeling nothing emotional when the Twin Towers went down.
Yeah.
I mean, that's much more Malcolm X. But in any case, one of the striking things about his book, besides this switch away from looking at the black family and misadaptations to difficult situations in the 80s, one of the things is he doesn't have any program. And in fact, Michelle Alexander, when she reviewed his book, totally agrees with how racist white society is and so on and so on. After all, she's got this book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration.
Yeah.
But she has to criticize him for not giving any hope. I mean, you read that book, it says, you are foolish to try to succeed if you're a black. Even though he and his family did, you're foolish. And I think that that's not his problem, but is, I think, a problem of the Black Lives Matters movement as well. And that is, they really don't have very good solutions to what you do with the black underclass. What do you do with a population that seems to produce, and I think it's because of single-headed households, multi-partner fertility.
And we'll get there. I want you to talk about that at greater length.
But what do you do when you get such a large component of black youth, particularly black boys, getting into high school with very significant academic and behavioral deficits? What do you do about that? And what do they say? Well, we shouldn't have suspensions. We shouldn't have incarceration, which is true. That's not a real solution. It may be helpful to society, but it's not helpful to that community.
It sweeps the problem under the rug.
It sweeps it under the rug. But what do you do with this population that ends up 17, 18-year-olds with significant academic and behavioral deficits? Okay. They're on the street, and they don't really have much to say about what you do about it. They don't support President Obama's Brothers Keepers agenda, right? He's got an agenda for that population. Maybe it should be scaled up. Maybe there's good parts of it. There's bad parts of it. But Michael Smith, who runs it, is not, they don't promote him. They don't promote what he does.
So I want to hear what you think should be done and why you think it should be done. I want to hear more about your diagnosis of exactly what the problem is. But I first want to push back a little bit. I'll observe that you say Michelle Alexander. I haven't seen her review. I'll look it up. Melvin Rogers, who's a political theorist at the UCLA, had something in The Atlantic in response to Coates that I thought very much stressed this point that, there's no hope. There's someone called Robert Chatterton Williams who lives in Paris and has a piece in the London Review reviewing Coates' book, An African-American Philosopher, who too stresses the inadequacy of Coates' narrative along exactly the line that you say. So it's not as if nobody has noticed this. Not that you're saying no one has, but I just wanted to say that. The other thing I want to say and hear what you might say in response, Robert, is I think Coates would say, look, all of those inadequacies of the social life in the community that I described in The Beautiful Struggle are themselves the product of the kind of white supremacist domination of black bodies that I articulated in my second book. He would say, yeah, family is messed up. Yeah, there was a lot of father absence. Yeah, there were kind of peer pressures and sort of, behavioral dynamics that were dysfunctional. But you know what? Those were people who were shuttled, kept in these ghettos, who were redlined, who were for decades kept from good employment, kept out of the unions, blah, 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 blah. Politicians pointing to them as the problem of American society and so on. So that you can't talk about the family structure or the behaviors of blacks without reference to the larger environment of racial oppression.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, I agree that a lot of the source of the problem of black male joblessness, for example, a lot of it has to do with discriminatory practices. Certainly, this whole Jim Crow legacy has to do with racist practices. But the problem is that you still have to deal with what is going on today. And you should not allow there to ignore personal responsibility. You shouldn't make that the only thing, but there's a role for personal responsibility. And I think that things have to be done if you don't want to reproduce these 17 and 18-year-olds the way we are producing them. Let me just give one other point. CNN, has this reporter, Mark Lamont Hill.
Mark
right?
Lamont Hill, yeah.
So he had a piece in CNN's online essays, and he references a CNN survey that was done asking people about the black, what's going on in the black community.
Yeah.
And he focused on how many blacks say in the last 30 days they've experienced some untoward action, not simply by the police, but the restaurants they live in, the restaurants they go to, and so on. But in that survey, they also asked, what do you think are causes of the social and economic plight of black Americans? And black Americans, 61%, now they said discrimination and a number of things, but 61% of black respondents said family disorganization is an important cause. Only 18% said it was no cause at all. So here you have the black community, and actually it was higher than what the white community said. You had a similar thing asking about personal responsibility and motivation, willingness to work hard. 42% of the black respondents said that is an important cause of the problem. Only 21% said it was no cause at all. So I think that, I don't want to read an incredible amount into it, but I think there are a lot of Americans now who are willing to help people and to be sympathetic to the problems that exist if they see some level of personal responsibility. Now, that gets into the deserving and the undeserving poor. And we had that decades ago, that this idea of splitting the poor into deserving and undeserving has a lot of problems. But I think correctly, many Americans are taken aback at this whole entitlement of victimizations that they see. And there was an article in the Times about why poor white communities in the nation are increasingly voting Republican. And Alex McGillis, I think so he went into these communities, and what he found, these are all white communities, and what he found was that, yes, they're getting a lot of safety net programs, they're getting food stamps, SSI, and so on, but the people who work in those communities, their neighbors, their relatives, are like pissed off at how many people they see who have just given up and are just living off of the dole. So I think that you could overstate this and you can use this in the most negative way,
of course,
for not being sympathetic to the poor. But I think that's a dynamics that's going on now where there's a need for a certain amount of personal responsibility, and that families should be taken to task if they abandon their kids, if they mistreat them in the house, that these kinds of things are probably more important than many other things.
Okay, I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on a roll, but I do want to draw a distinction. The distinction is between the political efficacy of emphasizing personal responsibility as a way of gaining or retaining the support for necessary policy interventions from a majority of the population, since blacks or more broadly blacks and Latinos in the low-income part of the society are a minority. So you need people like working class white people to buy into whatever it is that you might be proposing, and they may be alienated to the extent, as you described, that they perceive people not trying to help themselves. That's one point. But that's a different point from a causal argument, which says that as the available remedies are assayed, the likelihood of success is significantly diminished unless we can persuade people to behave differently from the way that they're behaving. Not in order to get somebody's vote somewhere, but just as a matter of fact that there's no substitute for effectively intervening without them taking on more.
I don't see a conflict between that unless one would say that what whites want to hear is that personal responsibility is the whole story. That would be kind of a racist accommodation. But to the extent that this view of, and it's not only whites, it's, as I said, the black respondents in the CNN survey. It was the black respondents that even more than the white respondents said that this personal responsibility is an important reason. So this is not a black-white issue. This is an issue where, for better or worse, and I think for better, hardworking, employed, middle class, lower middle class, and middle class, both black and white families, think there should be more personal responsibility. And what that means is that the school system, for example, when kids are acting out, and it's clear that there are things going on in the family, they should find ways to engage the family in it, not simply decide whether or not we're going to suspend the kid, but have a way of pulling in the family. Now, there could be positive carrots, not just negative, threatening to take away the kid, let's say, right? I mean, that's crazy.
That's the ultimate.
But there
if you take the kid
has
away,
to
what are
be
you going to
much
do with
more
the
of
kid?
a realization that what goes on in the household for kids, particularly the young boys, when they're 5 to 10 years old, is important to head off and not have to deal with it when they're in high school, and there's a limited amount that you can do. And I think only by saying, yes, that's a real problem, and getting on board that we have to find ways, constructive ways to intervene in the family, only then can we begin to, some people on the right say we should shame people, right? That there's a shaming that has to go on. I don't like that word, but there has to be a way to have interaction and
Okay,
intervention.
hold on. I got to rein you in a little bit because, there's so many things on the table.
Okay.
Let's just talk about school discipline and suspensions for a minute, because my understanding is that the Justice Department under President Obama has taken it unto itself to review the racial disparities in school discipline as one of the possible arenas of civil rights enforcement, and to try to pressure local districts to attend to their patterns of suspending so as not to produce. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, of the popular discourse around this, at least in many quarters, is there's implicit bias. Black kids are being suspended for actions that if a white kid were to undertake it wouldn't be perceived quite the same way. There's a kind of criminalization with police officers. There was that infamous incident, I think it was in South Carolina, where a security person threw the kid off the chair onto the floor, and that went viral, and so forth and so on. So the narrative is just like mass incarceration and criminal offending, with Michelle Alexander's narrative that it's the new Jim Crow and it's just an indirect way of suppressing, just like what Ta-Nehisi Coates has to say in that essay in The Atlantic on the Moynihan Report and mass incarceration, where the implication is that the country became hyper-punitive as a substitute for doing something substantive about the problems that Moynihan had identified, that still, at the end of the day, it's racism, institutional racism that is at work. And you're saying something very different, and I really just want to underscore it. You're saying, well, there may be some of these problems about implicit bias and so forth, and certainly to that extent, one should attend to it. But the likelihood is that there are real behavioral differences by race that have an explanation that we can come to understand, and that if we really want to solve these problems, forcing districts to change their suspension behavior will not go to the root of the issue. The root of the issue is about the socialization of the kid at home or the lack thereof. And we have to find effective ways of getting our hands on and improving before these behavioral problems manifest themselves, the influences on these developing youngsters.
I had an article in the Liberal Spotlight on Poverty at the beginning of this year on this whole issue of implicit racism being the reason for these disparate suspension rates. These disparate suspension rates are not 3 to 2. They're not close. They're 2.5 times. They're 2.5 times in kindergarten, pre-K. These behavioral problems manifest themselves, and what is being papered over is that black youth seem, and this is I'm getting from the proponents of getting rid of a lot of the suspensions, that black youth tend to give teachers much more lip. They'll curse them, they'll talk back to them, and they're suspended for that. White youth are suspended for having marijuana in their lockers, what are a bit more serious or more legal kinds of things than this kind of disrespect that black youth tend to have. And, I'm not in the school system, but in many ways, if you get disrespected by students and you don't control the classroom, you're in a lot of trouble. So while individually, each one of these disrespectful dynamics may seem minor in why is somebody sent somewhere, there's a certain dynamics, and it's not going to explain the 2.5 to 1 disparity. And you get into a situation where if teachers can't easily control the classroom, where you have students who are a grade or two behind, they're 16 years old, they're just biting time in the classroom because they're very distant from graduating or, so you have a very difficult population. And to just paper it over and saying it's this implicit racial bias that, even though the fact that many of these are black teachers. I mean, an increasing share of the teachers in urban America are black. I mean, they're not white teachers. In New York City, they're black teachers. So it papers over that there are things that you begin to see in the elementary school, in pre-K, and you then have these grade or two behind in reading. You look at the percentage coming into high school of black youth who are on grade level. You're just seeing problems, and I'm not anyone to say what's the best way to handle this anger and unruliness and somewhat disrespect at the high school level. Certainly suspensions is not the best way to handle it.
Yeah.
But there's something real there that is being papered over by blaming racism for the statistics.
Okay, now, therefore, I want to push you on to describe the lay of the land as you set it out in your National Affairs article about what are some of the problems in the social capital, family life, communal relations, attitudes, values, and beliefs, behavioral practices characteristic of the African American lower class that you think are at work here, and also then to what do you imagine to be some of the possible solutions for those problems?
Well, first of all, it's not simply a black underclass, but there's an increasing white underclass.
Good.
But it's not nearly as large, and it hasn't been as long-term as the seriousness in the black community. And it's rooted, I think, in the employment problems of black men. Because without stable employment, you don't have stable family situations. And without stable family situations, you're going to have these problems with the development of black youth, particularly black boys. So, I think that what happens is if you have, it's not simply 72% of black children are born out of wedlock, but 60% of black women who have more than one kid have them with different men. So you have this multi-partner fertility. And why that's important is you have this father go round where in the house there is a sequence of male figures, some of whom may be father to the most recent children, but not to all of the children in the house. And in those situations, the children whose father has left have a lot of difficulty. And it's piled on to poverty and all the structural kinds of things, but that's then piled on. And that's why you see a lot of acting out in the schools. That's why you see there's all kinds of data on the difficulties that children, not simply being brought up in single-family homes, but when they are brought up absent the father in the family. And it's compounded by the school system that's much more sympathetic to young girls. The kinds of books that are read, the kinds of activities that are allowed are much more female-centered, so that boys in general have problems in the early grades. They're much more rambunctious. They act so-called act out in ways that proper girls don't. But it's magnified for these young kids that come from these family formations that I've described.
I just want to ask you, this phenomenon, which is a stunning thing in my mind, 60% of African American women with more than one child the children have different fathers. I'm not making any moral judgment about that whatsoever, but it just strikes me as a very interesting and important social fact. And you're saying that that means that the kids in the serial father situation who are not, their father not present may get inadequate attention and be treated in ways that are deleterious to their development. But what I want to ask you is, how does that compare, for example, to low-income white or Latino
Well,
family
overall in the
dynamics?
white population, it's 29%. 29% of white mothers with more than one kid have them with different men.
What's the source of those data?
So it's not broken down socioeconomically. But one of the things that is broken down that I mentioned in my article is because of the lack of black men who go on and get college degrees, twice as many black women as black men get 4-year degrees. Black women with college degrees don't marry as much. Over 60%, I have it in the article, over 60% of black women 25 to 35 with a college degree are unmarried compared to 38% of white women in that age group, college-educated white women.
Wow.
So, you have a lot of dynamics that go on because black men are falling behind. And we have to figure out how to not let them get lost. In New York City, there's over 200,000 youth, 17 to 24, who are neither in school nor at work. There is a large population of young, primarily men, disproportionately black men, who are lost. They're like the lost boys. And less suspensions in the high schools is not going to solve that problem. Having police not be as aggressive at times and inappropriate at times is not going to solve that problem. They might be, it'll solve some problems, but it's not going to solve the problem of these lost boys that, and I don't want to put all of it on this multi-partner fertility, but it's one of the factors that accentuates the difficulty that poor folks, particularly poor black folks, have raising kids in society today. And just giving more EITC or welfare is not going to, another $3,000 or $5,000 certainly will be helpful, but it's not going to do the trick. You have to figure out how to increase the employment rate of black men dramatically.
All right. So what are you thinking are feasible, politically feasible policies that might have that effect?
Well, I think we have to engage many more of these youth at the high school level and get them into either direct employment or into certificate programs. That is, in some ways, the lowest rung. And because we have to, their skills are so weak that they're not material for 4-year colleges and for many of the 2-year associate's degrees. New York City had a big splash when President Obama came with P-TECH and career and technical education. And New York City dramatically expanded. These are high school programs where you earn college credits towards occupational 2-year programs. Mm-hmm. And then if you're successful, you go into the community colleges into those 2-year programs. Mm-hmm. That has broadly not been that successful because for many of these kids, they were already in high school with such limited skill and behavioral skills that they can't succeed because some of these programs are modestly demanding. They have to do some math. They have to do with certain kinds of stuff that they're distant, somewhat distant. So I think direct employment would have been a solution. And I tried to write as much as I could a year and 2 years ago on this direct employment, and I can send you 4 or 5 articles that I wrote about that. But teenage employment has collapsed. And, you know, particularly if we have a higher minimum wage, I mean, are you going to hire a teenager for 13, 14 bucks an hour if you can get an adult? Which you can if you had those wages of 13, 14 bucks an hour. You can get a lot of adults who'll take those jobs.
Yes, you would. Oh, by the way, Bob, center yourself relative to the video frame.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's why I think that these certificate, which are short-term, 6-month, a year, some are 2-year programs, that these are the kinds of programs. You become a security guard. You do some. You get a job, and in some ways, they're not such bad jobs, but they're consistent, much more consistent with where kids are. And look, it would be the greatest thing if this country had a youth corps where, you know, you had to do a year's service for a year, kind of. I'm just so worried about what happens to kids that just are spewed out of the school system without any real skills. They haven't had experiences that improve their behavioral traits, their interpersonal relationships, and how they work in groups and so on. Those what are called soft skills. They're just spewed out of the schools, put on the street, and nothing good is going to happen if they're on the street. And I think it's a real nut to crack. And I'm not surprised that whether it's Coates or the Black Lives Matters movement, they focus on police, they focus on discipline in schools, but they don't really know what to do about a very serious problem, particularly if they're not willing to look into family formation issues.
Connect these things for me then. I'm with you both with respect to being willing to open my eyes to what's going on in the family and realizing it could be problems. And also to affirming the importance of investing in providing developmental employment opportunities that meet these young people, men and women, but especially men, since they are more likely to be disconnected, meets them where they are and gives them an opportunity to get a foot on the bottom rung. What's the connection between, on the one hand, I mean, because we could have argued for public employment, youth corps, and various other kinds of, low-end employment promotion, with or without reference to the social dynamics of what's going on in the African-American family. How do you see those two things being connected?
Well, I see them being connected in that it would be great if we could reduce the number of youth who get to high school in these deficit situations, and therefore having much more of an engagement with the family earlier. Figuring out, look, I did interviews when I did a book on welfare reform. I interviewed women who had gotten off of welfare. Some of them were incredibly terrific and welcomed guidance and support on personal matters. So that I think if done correctly, that's to some extent what the Harlem Education Zone attempted to do, to look holistically at the child, not simply what happens in school and everything else is somebody else's business. So that I think that there's no reason why we can't do both. That is, deal with the youth where they are and try to move them forward in constructive ways, but also having much more engagement with the family in ways that can head off some of the kinds of behavioral problems that are manifestations of dynamics in the house that are brought to the school.
Okay, the holistic treatment that you were referring to, that's the Harlem Children's Zone,
Right.
Jeffrey, Canada. But engagement with the family, so this is dicey, no? I mean, the ultimate...
Well, you need many more social workers in the school system. You don't have social workers in the school system. You have psychological for testing kids and help, but you don't have social workers in the school system because, we have a kind of dynamics where we can't impose on the personal space of families.
You want a professional following the kid home from school when there's a problem and
being available,
okay,
and finding positive carrots to engage the family. After all, there was an attempt to give extra money of kids for attendance. Who's the guy at Harvard who oversaw?
Roland Fryer.
Right. So he had.
By the way, Roland Fryer is a former student of mine and almost like a son to me.
Where'd you go wrong?
Say it again.
Where did you go wrong?
Where did I go? Come on, he's a great guy.
I know.
He found that the financial incentive intervention wasn't particularly effective at raising academic performance in the study that he did in New York City. He went on to Houston, running a massive experimental intervention in schools, which imbued the public schools there that he treated with a KIPP Academy-like charter school philosophy, and was with random assignment of kids able to show that changing the curriculum, changing teacher motivation, lengthening the school day, and so forth had really significant beneficial effects for the performance of the kids in these schools. I didn't go wrong. This is he just won the Clark Medal. What are you talking about, man? I'm so proud of him like the bus.
I wasn't saying, it's a little more nuanced, these financial incentives in New York. Some had some effect, but not for grades. It was if you brought in your homework, certain attempts. But what I was trying to say, I could have done it more articulately, was that
you're doing fine.
There's ways of giving positive incentives to engage the family. Again, what I had said a half hour ago, you don't want to say, look, if you don't come in, we're going to take the kid away from you.
Right.
There are positive ways, but you have to have the staff. So, for example, someone told me that the only way these kids can often get help is if they're classified as special ed kids. Special ed kids get a lot of stuff. So if a kid's really acting out in class, but he doesn't have the classic special ed, sometimes they put that kid in special ed just so he can get the services that he needs. So I'm much more into getting those resources in the elementary school, finding positive ways to engage the families can go a long way to helping reduce the number of kids who get to high school who are at risk.
Yeah.
But the other thing is about what you do for jobs.
Yeah.
There's still so much of a desire for people to go on, at least to the colleges, where then they can, if they go to the community, they can transfer to the four-year colleges and get a degree. And that nobody recommends these certificate programs. I was talking in New York City to a wonderful woman who helps place men who come out of the prisons with a GED degree. New York is very effective. If you go to prison, getting people into GED programs so that when they come out of prison, they're much more likely to have a GED degree. But what do you do with them when they come out? She would not recommend certificate programs because you couldn't get state funding. They would have to take out a student loan to pay a modest, and these are certificate programs run by CUNY. They're not even in the for-profit sector. So, as I said, the progressive sector doesn't look very favorably on what Michael D. Smith and Brothers Keeper is doing.
Yeah.
They're very reluctant to look at things like certificate programs that will cost some money for students and will get them into a narrow field rather than opening up college to them. It's well-meaning, but I think when you say you have to take these youth where they are, that means very much like welfare reform in the 1990s.
90s.
You had to have a jobs-first approach. You couldn't say, well, let them go 2 years to the community college, let's this or that. I think it was appropriate because once they get into a job, after all, if a 19-year-old kid works for 2 years or 3 years at one of these certificate program jobs, who's to say he can't go on to college?
Sure.
He's not locked out, but he has this maturity, he has this discipline that he would get from this so-called low-end job.
Bob, this is very interesting, and I'm so glad you came on the show. We're kind of out of time. I want to make a comment at the end and get your reaction to it. The comment is somewhat political, not really partisan, but it's this. I'm in the academy, as are you, and you and I both know that if you go to a sociology department and you try to tell somebody about serial paternity and such like that, they're going to run you out of there as a neo-fascist or something. It's just gotten that bad. And what I want to observe is that here is a guy, I'm talking about you, Robert Cherry, who is prepared to talk about personal responsibility, behavior, and dysfunction, characteristic of lower-class African-American life, and in the same breath is prepared to talk about putting more social workers in the schools and making sure that we have meaningful employment opportunities for people who have essentially no skills. Oh, that's going to cost money. This is not a conservative, lock them up, throw away the key, we don't give a damn about the poor attitude. There's no necessary connection between, on the one hand, being willing to look in the face the ugly reality of what goes on in the backwaters and the corners and the margins of our society, and at the same time caring about people and being prepared to ask the rest of the society to pony up in order to produce the kinds of programs and interventions that would help them. So the posture that, Ta-Nehisi Coates takes, when Mitch Landrieu, mayor of New Orleans, confronts him with the unresolved homicide cases, and his answer is, Ta-Nehisi, there ain't nothing wrong with black folks that ending white supremacy won't fix. Well, that's just not good enough. There's plenty, quote, wrong with black folks, close quote, without trying to impute any intrinsic inability or immorality. There's plenty wrong. And there are ways of fixing it short of ending white supremacy, which I don't even know what that means anyway. Anyway, that's Glenn Loury's editorial at the end. You can repudiate everything I said if you want to. Or just say you're right, Glenn.
I agree. You're right, Glenn.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Okay. Happy New Year.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.